Greetings and welcome to Art Schools Network's No More webinar series. We're so glad you could take 30 minutes out of your very busy day in your art schools and organizations to spend time with us and our guest speaker and interviewers to discuss new approaches to assessing arts integrated learning. Our guest speakers are Arnold April and our interviewer is David Flatley. I'm Christy Calloway, and Art Schools Network is a national and international collective of art school leaders who get together to exchange best practices. If you have a best practice idea that you think our audience would be interested in, please let me know and we can schedule a conspiracy. Today, when our guests get started, you might have questions for them. Please post a question in the question box and we will funnel them to the panelists. They will then respond to them either live or towards the end with the Q&A section. They've structured today's presentation to be about 20 minutes of discussion and then 10 minutes of Q&A. Now I'd like to introduce you to David Flatley, my esteemed colleague and a Board of Director member for the Art Schools Network. David, could you please tell us a little bit about your work and then introduce us to our special guest?
Sure. Well, good morning, Christy, and good morning to all of you. I'm delighted to be doing this morning and that Arnie's agreed to join us and share his expertise. I've actually been working with Arnie for the past 20 years on the amazing work of arts integration that has been unfolding in Chicago and moving out nationally. And it's actually CAPE and the organization that Arnie started 20 years ago, a little over 20 years ago, that actually got me into the world of arts education, and I fell in love with it and never looked back. And I landed about 9 years ago here at Columbia College running the Center for Community Arts Partnerships that does a lot of interesting work in the community, working with schools and community arts organizations, and of course does some high-level work in arts integration. I welcome you to look at our website. But now I'd like to introduce our guest presenter. Arnold April has been engaged in this work deeply for well over 2 decades. He's a theater artist and a visual artist and a multidisciplinary artist in his own right, but has really carved out an expertise that is outstanding in the realm of how the arts can be a catalyst and vehicle for learning across the curriculum, and travels around the country and around the world speaking about this work and consulting. And he has joined us today to focus on the work of assessing student learning in the arts, and specifically arts integration. And we all know that there's not enough energy and time spent on this particular element. Teachers are always assessing their students, but we need to develop more rigorous tools to assess the learning that happens in the arts across the curriculum. And Arnie's been focusing on this particular work through grants through the Community Trust and with his work with CAPE. So I'm going to turn it over to Arnie.
Hi, y'all. When we encounter assessment, we often experience assessment as the creature on the wing. We're flying along in our airplanes, like we see this gentleman looking out of this monster on the wing, and we experience assessment as tearing apart our wing while we're flying. David, anything you want to say about this image?
Well, I'm grateful that you gave a nod to those Trekkies among us, those that can recognize William Shatner in the very early Star Trek. So those of you that are early Star Trek fans can appreciate the classic episode.
Okay, so let's move on. All right, so next slide.
Hey, wait a second. That was Twilight Zone. That wasn't it? That's a Twilight Zone episode.
That's a Twilight Zone.
Oh, you might be right. You're right.
I think I'm a deeper Trekkie than you are.
Because of William Shatner. My bad. Okay, Christy, you got me.
That was pre-Twilight Zone. That was pre-Star Trek. All right.
Right.
So one of the problems we have with assessment is that we tend to think of assessment as trying to prove that everything we're doing is perfect. We're trying to pretend perfection to our different funders, bosses, ourselves. And I think it's more useful to start thinking of assessment as action research, where you're really trying to learn about what's working and not working for our students. So assessment is really for our students and ourselves first, and for people that we have to report to second. And then how do we decide what to assess? A lot of assessment historically tends to be about content knowledge and about technical skills. And I think it's useful to start thinking about more conceptual approaches to assessment, um, especially as we move into Common Core, which is a more conceptual approach to curriculum. And I think it's useful for you to investigate the understanding by design model created by Jay McTeague and Grant Wiggins, in which you develop your instruction based on thinking through what are the enduring understandings and more conceptual knowledge approaches that your students need to demonstrate developing capacity for. And then you figure out what would be evidence of them having incorporated these enduring understandings, and only then do you develop your instructional plans. So as we proceed, next slide, to what kind of tools do we develop to assess learning, and specifically arts-integrated learning, we need to think about several different tools, the instruments that we could use. So one of them is rubrics. Problem with rubrics is, again, they tend to get very often focused on content knowledge and technical skills. So as we develop rubrics, we need to think about several things. What are the limits of rubrics? When do they fail to capture some of the more unexpected outcomes that happen in the instruction? Rubrics can close our thinking in. Who fills them out? Are the students self-assessing using a rubric? Are the teachers assessing the students? How can the rubrics be designed so that different people using the same instrument come up with similar results, that the results are reliable and valid? And who designs them and how? Do students have a voice in reframing and redesigning rubrics? How do you get consensus among your faculty about rubrics you would share? And then when are they administered? Do you use them as pre and posts? Is it fair to do a pre and post the very first session of a unit? So there's lots of things to think through in terms of making rubrics work. And as you have questions, we will be able to address them at the end of our discussion between David and myself. So in lots of schools that I've been working with that are developing rubrics around arts-integrated instruction, we're seeing a really interesting pattern that moves from the beginning, developing, accomplished, and exemplary, and instead looks at behaviorals, observable behaviors among the students as they integrate new knowledge and practice, where they move from originally complying with teacher instructions, then behaviors that show they're experimenting with that area of content. Then they move to internalizing it, making it not something that they're testing, but as something they can really use and feel comfortable with. And when they start to use new areas of knowledge for initiative and original choices and applications outside the classroom. And these are actually observable and measurable, and we found that organizations that use those sorts of frameworks come up with very interesting practices. So next slide. All right, so if you're doing arts-integrated instruction, you have a couple choices about the sort of rubrics that you would develop. Here's an example of some rubrics that can be used across all different disciplines, arts disciplines, other academic disciplines. These were developed by Chicago High School for the Arts, which is part of the ASN network. And we're not going to go through them right now, but I suggest you come back and look at these later and think about how you could use similar rubrics across all kinds of different disciplines and content areas. All right, next slide, please. Next slide, please. There we go. So here's another example of a rubric that is very discipline specific. This was about some teachers who developed a rubric around the integration of understanding history and understanding theater. So you can develop rubrics that are very discipline specific for integrated instruction, and you can also develop rubrics that go across all disciplines. And so I suggest that when you have some more time, you look at this because I think it's really a very interesting and successful rubric that provides some real information. So next slide, please. Next slide, please.
Christy, I know I want to hold on to this slide. I love this one. The exemplary level, particularly the choice part. The learner makes the choice. That's fantastic.
Well, we found over and over again, whatever people are measuring, when they start to think more conceptually about their rubrics, they come up with these really observable behaviors that show a progression in students internalizing and applying their knowledge. And so we found this really useful, and it's useful for instruction as well, because the kids can look at the rubric and say, oh, this is what I need to do to grow. This is where it's okay for me to start. And so we found it very, very useful. And then also you'll notice in this rubric, they talk about the student making choices for his or her actual artistic production. The student moves from being a receiver of new knowledge to an activist worker in the world, that they're actually having an impact as they apply their new knowledge.
Briefly, just to interject, Arnie, I so appreciate both the general and the specific examples. Going back to the general one, and of course we won't do this now, but I would love to actually maybe do a little work group within ASN and see if we could go back to your compliance, experimentation, internalization, which I think is a really nice framing, and use those up on the top instead of the beginner, exemplary, and so forth.
Yes, that's a really interesting
talk through what
idea,
that would
David.
look like as a cross-discipline application. So
that's
a good
great.
idea for later.
Go back to that general one just for a moment. I said we wouldn't go in depth, but I lied. Just notice the categories, looking at developing technical skill, developing originality, and developing critique skills. That could happen in a science class, that could happen in a dance class. These were areas that we really realized were genuinely cross-disciplinary. And so they actually become a basis for integration rather than an obstacle to integration. Okay, let's move on. So there's that, and moving on again. So one of the problems that people have with using rubrics is they're kind of a pain in the butt to apply, because you got piles of paper and kids are circling different levels, and you got to tabulate them, and it becomes very time intensive. So some of the schools I was working with said, well, why don't you put the rubrics onto Google Docs and make it real easy to fill out online. And I was very technophobic and resisted this for 2 years, and I finally did it. And it's real easy to do. You can make really good forms, it's very useful. And then the data goes immediately into a rubric data collection that you can download as an Excel sheet and produce graphs like the one coming up. Next slide, please. Okay, next slide. All right, so I was able to collect the data and produce a really cool graph real fast. Next slide, please.
Arnie, if people are interested in learning a little bit more about how they might actually do that with Google Docs, is that something that you have more information on the CAPE website, or is that something folks can follow up directly with you on?
That's a good question, David. At the end of this, you'll see my email address. Anyone who wants to can email me. I'll walk you through how to set up these Google Docs. It's very easy to do. Yeah,
that's great.
Anyone who wants to can contact me, and I can show you how easy it is to set up these Google Doc forms and make these groovy charts real easily. The organizations that have been doing this with me in Chicago are reporting that their assessment time is being cut down tenfold, that they're not resisting collecting data, they're producing very cool graphs and charts, they're really using assessment to improve their instruction, and the students appreciate it. All right, so the next area is video conference assessments. Just stay up there. When you have time, I really recommend you cut and paste this link and watch this video. This is a methodology built on lots of previous colleagues. Some of the colleagues that David and I worked with many years ago developed this method of really doing dialogue analysis, interaction analysis. This is a method where some students are given some material they're working with, and then there's an interview with the students about their methodologies and their processes, and the kids react to each other, and their teacher observes the interviews. Then later, she or he is interviewed about what she or he noticed about the kids' interactions. This particular video is work by Chicago Children's Theater in a school that focuses on really exemplary work with kids on the autism spectrum. And you can use these video conferences as pre and posts. You can get all kinds of really fabulous data, and the learners themselves can look at the videos and see how they've grown. It's a fabulous process.
This reminds me of Linda Mabry from Indiana University, worked with us years ago and talked about all these different levels of assessment, kinds of assessment, and I think she would have called this discourse assessment, although it's actually documenting it on video so that people can go back and analyze it. It's very rich, probably more time consuming, but very rich. How long is this video if people go back and look at it?
This is about 7 minutes,
Okay.
but it actually ends up being very time efficient because it takes a little time to set up, but you get an enormous amount of data very quickly, and it's very moving and vivid and lively and funny. It's a fabulous process. I recommend it very highly. All right, next slide, please. All right, so another area, and this tends to be a little bit time-consuming, is to ask your learners a bunch of open-ended questions, and then you count and categorize the types of responses, and you get fabulous pre and post. So Black Ensemble Theater was working with a school that was very interested in kids developing skills in conflict resolution while they're studying academic content, whether it was science or literature. The kids' ability to discourse respectfully was very weak, and they wanted to know if theater made a difference. So we just had the kids answer the question, how do you show respect for people you disagree with? And in the pre, which is in red, we got these responses. We got a lot of kids saying, you stop hitting someone. That's how you show respect. Another set said, you butt in and tell them what you think. And most of the kids said, in the pre, you just let them know you disagree. In the post, this completely changed. And we got, instead, most of the kids saying, you try to understand their point of view, you find where you agree, you discuss compromise. There's this radical shift that we have, quantitative evidence by doing analysis of response to an open-ended question. All right, moving on. Last off, you need to know that your assessments, whether they're for arts integration or anything else, inherently have flaws. You don't know what works or doesn't work until you try it out. So you've got to kind of throw the spaghetti at the wall and see what sticks, and then you've got to refine them. All right, so let's move on to the last slide before we open up for responding to questions. So there's a couple of resources you should know about. www.artsassessment.org is a website that I created through Chicago Arts Partnerships in Education. And it's got methods for developing assessment tools, examples of actual instruments from 50 different organizations. It's a nice compendium of organizations, arts organizations' experiments with schools. And then last off is my email. And I really do invite people who want to ask some questions and go further deeper in, in sending me their questions, and I'll get back to you. All right, do we have any time left, Christy?
Oh, we sure do. We sure do. I'm going to share a comment that has come in, Arnie, and maybe you can elaborate a little bit. One of the participants indicated that one of the reasons why they like the rubric is that, of course, they are looking at they're actually looking for skills and content knowledge, which they thought you had mentioned is potentially a limitation. I'm not sure I heard it exactly like that. I think what I heard you say was that rubrics are, of course, very often focusing on skills and content knowledge, but as we're thinking about reframing the way a rubric is designed in order to support the arts learning and how the arts learning is being applied to support the learner in those content areas, that you just think a little bit differently about how you design it so that it's not limited to the skills and content knowledge. Can you elaborate a little bit more on that?
And it's actually, I'm not against content knowledge or skill development, but I think we need to think about not only are the skills there, or is the content knowledge there, but is it increasingly being used? In other words, it's about skills and content knowledge in application, not just, was it there? Like, there was a theater that was working with an English teacher, and they did a play, and all the assessments were around, did you remember the names of the characters, or how old were they? It was kind of informational. I was working with a teacher who was trying to develop an arts integrated unit, and I said it's good to think of what's a core inquiry question for developing enduring understandings, and she was studying geography, and all her rubrics were about naming the capitals of the states in the U.S. And she was trying to teach, roles of government, but she just ended up collecting information. So it's useful to know the capitals of the states, but how does that information come to life?
Right,
so I'm
and
totally
applied.
with you, David. It's that we're not against skills or content knowledge, but we have to think about how they're activated, used, and analyzed by the students.
Another participant was mentioning that they're working with WestEd, and curious a little bit about how this compares and contrasts to some of the work that they're doing around assessment. And I know you're familiar with their work. Do you have anything to say to that?
Well, what I'm focused on is how do teachers collect information with their students to progress the learning in the classroom. And what WestEd is trying to help us do is figure out what are some of the techniques that allow us to aggregate data across schools, across classrooms, across states, across the nation. So there are slightly different approaches to the on-the-ground assessment and the aggregated large-scale assessments. And I think we've been pushed to focus on the large scale, how do we test the development of the arts in whole states? And I think we need to spend more time developing our more intimate on-the-ground practice, and I think that's going to inform the large scale much better. What WestEd said is that there's a lot of interesting stuff going on, but it hasn't coalesced yet into a methodology that connects the on-the-ground practice with the larger policy concerns. And I think we need to invest more time in the classroom level to help inform the work that folks like WestEd are doing. That's my opinion.
I have a question actually for you, Arnie, and I probably should have planted the seed before, so participants need to know that I didn't actually talk to Arnie about this before, so it's perfectly fair for you to say we don't know enough about this, but I'm always fascinated with the idea of transfer, and if we're teaching certain or looking for certain kind of higher order thinking skills that we see emanate out of an arts integrated lesson in this particular realm, we sometimes see that replicated or emerging in another content area, even though we're not working in that area because we worked on it over here. I'm curious if you can speak to if there are any assessment tools that you've seen that look at that particular question.
That's a great question, David. Can we go back to the rubric that goes across disciplines? And there, no, there, that one. Or, no, up one. There, that one.
Yep.
The cross-disciplinary. what this one did is looked at some cross-disciplinary skills. Critique, originality, technical skills. We actually developed a bunch of others, but this was the example I gave. What you could do is, and what CAPE actually did in a study called PAIR, pairresults.org, I think, is the website. Anyway, what they did was they used some of these cross-disciplinary rubrics, but they looked at different interventions and balances. So if the kids just had arts instruction but no integrated instruction, how do these skills transfer? If they just had language arts instruction but no arts instruction, what did these skills show? And when they had all three, direct instruction in literature, direct instruction in the arts, and integrated instruction, what did these skills show up as? And in other words, you track your interventions and then you measure the cross-disciplinary transfers. And they got really vivid results showing that the combination of arts integration, and other discipline-specific content knowledge got the strongest results and closed achievement gaps. So that's very interesting to me.
Yeah, well, that's helpful. You know what, I want to jump into another question here that came in that I think is fascinating, and I know we're running out of time, but one question came through asking about knowledge and a deeper understanding of certain theoretical understandings of what happens in the classroom, sense making, how this particular social constructivism, culturally responsive instruction, how these theories shape the design and model of both you know, assessing behavior and the design of curriculum. So arts integration, I think, dovetails, you know, strongly that this is a broad area. So we'd do a whole webinar probably on this particular question. But you want to respond to that, Arnie?
I think that we need another webinar to go into that more deeply. No, seriously.
Well, I guess the one thing I would say, because I think that this particular participant who is complimenting, several compliments have come through, so you've done a great job, was just wondering about how, you know, whether facilitators and folks that are engaged in this work like yourself, you know, how we benefit from an even stronger theoretical understanding. I know you and I have had many conversations about the social emotional learning piece and some of these other, you know, we all go back to Dewey and Piaget and Maxine Green around what real progressive education looks like. And I think those of us working in the arts feel that there's an inherent sensibility that this is absolutely supporting that. But we do need to get rigorous about how we measure it and look at it.
Absolutely. And, you know, what I think arts integration does is it creates praxis. It connects theories, content knowledge with action. And it provides a medium for the students to start being more self-directed in their own culturally responsive, socially constructed knowledge development. You know, it's essentially Freirean. And I think we need to be much more explicit about these theoretical underpinnings, and we need to collect the evidence of how this actually works and the changes it actually makes in learning.
Well, and I would argue that, yes, we need to do that, and I think we need to be more rigorous about how we're measuring, quote-unquote, higher-order thinking, critical thinking skills.
Absolutely.
How do we hone in on that and say, okay, this is the and we're actually doing this in a new model dissemination grant that we have in Evanston near Chicago, where we're looking at executive functioning skills, which are a bit different from higher order thinking skills in that it's focused on the other, and it's the organization of your time and certain dispositions, whereas the critical thinking skills are what we know they are, but we need to be more articulate. I think we're running out of time.
We're running out of time, so can I make one last comment?
Please.
Is I'm totally resonating with you, David. I think that people are very sloppy in the language they use. What do we mean by creativity? What do we mean by collaboration? What does it actually look like in detailed behavioral descriptions? And then what are the real adjustments in subjective thinking and attitudes that are going on with our students? And I don't think we've been rigorous enough in collecting that data.
I'm going to say a final comment and then turn it back over to Christy. I just want to thank my good friend and colleague Arnie for presenting and sharing with us this morning. We're in dialogue with him about possibly presenting in Denver in the fall at our conference, which will be very exciting. and we're grateful to be able to share with all of you during this busy time for a half hour. So Christy, any final words from your end as well?
Yes, thank you so much to both of you for putting this together. I love that this has been a multi-decade conversation between the two of you that we're able to share with the larger audience. And I want to say that at the very end we started getting a flurry of questions. We are definitely going to have a part 2 and 3 of this series. And I promise you, audience members, we're going to bring that to you within the next month. So again, thank you for giving us 30 minutes of your day. Thank you for your questions and engagement, and I hope you all have a wonderful week. Keep doing your great work. Have a great day.
Excuse me, Christy, can I just say one other thing before you go?
Please.
Just to repeat what Arnie said, and I know he means this very genuinely, you've got a copy of this. This webinar will be archived. All the slides are there.
Yes.
His email is there, so if your question wasn't answered, please don't hesitate to email him because he'll be very thoughtful and generous in responding to you.
And the questions are great. We're really sorry we didn't get to address all of them because they're terrific questions.
It's a wonderful problem. Again, thank you everyone for this shared dialogue. Have a great week.